Good afternoon to one and all. The third session of this one-day webinar is now will start. Our resource person, Dr. Srikumar Nellikapillai, Professor IIT Madras, is going to deliver a lecture on philosophical hermeneutics and question of truth. Before that, I welcome Dr.
Thank you, Professor.
Can I start?
Yeah, 1 minute. 1 minute. Welcome, Professor. Professor Srikumar Nellikapillai, Department of Humanity and Social Science, IIT Madras. The Department of Philosophy is organizing one-day national webinar on philosophy, science, and technology. On this, regarding a warm welcome to Srikumar Nellikapillai. He is a well-known person in the field of philosophy because he is the person getting for the patent, right, for in philosophical field, and he is a more eminent professor in the field of bioethics, and he delivered the many lecture in NTPL bioethics, and he is also more interested in research work, philosophy of Wittgenstein, phenomenology, philosophy of hermeneutic. He is a former lecturer at the Birla Institute of Technology and Science, Bilani. He is very popular in the online courses in NPTEL, and his topic is a philosophical hermeneutic and the questions of truth. Once again, I welcome Professor. You can proceed now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Tanur.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah. So I must thank Professor Thirumal, my friend, for giving this opportunity to interact with all of you on this day. This has been planned, I think, sometime last year itself, but for certain reasons, mainly my practical difficulties, we have been postponing it. And he kindly, he agreed. Whenever I had a problem, he used to call me and speak to me. Thank you, Professor Thirumal, for that personal warmth you have already showered on me. So, see, this is one topic. I mean, I'm basically interested in two issues in hermeneutics now, which I'm working on right now. One is the question of the idea of moral truth in hermeneutics, particularly the hermeneutics of Hans-Georg Gadamer. And the second one is the concept of truth itself. So, in fact, it was just 10 days back, I have delivered a talk on another webinar on the concept of moral truth, the idea of good in Gadamer's philosophy. So, some of these things are overlapping. So, those who have attended that talk might feel this a bit redundant. That's because, certain issues can never be, I can't avoid mentioning certain things which are common. And here what I'm going to do is, I will just try to outline the concept of truth which is presented, which is implied by Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics. So if you try to examine the history of truth, all of us know that, since most of us are students of philosophy, we know that truth is one of the primordial concerns of all philosophical traditions across the world, whether it is in India or elsewhere, Europe, everywhere. Okay, so it has been a primordial philosophical problem for philosophers across all traditions. And we can see that, if you examine the idea of truth as it is presented in the traditional philosophy. 1 minute, just give me a second. Okay, so if you examine the history of truth, we can see that truth was predominantly allied with metaphysics in the ancient traditions of philosophy. In almost all traditions, we could see that in India, for example, the concept of truth, which is almost equated with reality, which is done elsewhere as well. In the Western tradition also, there we could see such equations where ultimate reality, the summum bonum, is equated with truth, or the idea of good is equated with truth in Plato, and also with goodness. So we could see various approaches to this concept, and the different ideas about truth, which constantly allied truth with metaphysics and presented truth as predominantly as a metaphysical problem. Okay, so it was a problem which has got, at the same time, on the one hand, it is predominantly metaphysical, but at the same time, in many traditions, like Greek traditions and even in Indian tradition, there are important ontological implications, as only man finds truth as a problem. I mean, this is being re-articulated by Heidegger in 20th century, because Heidegger basically problematizes the concept of being, and says that the concept of being, the question of being, is a problem only for Dasein, or the being of man. It is actually originally a Greek idea. In fact, he himself says that it's a Greek idea. And in India, we could see that, it is with the man. Man raises the concept of truth. That is the ultimate realization which man can reach. And there are various ways in which this idea has been articulated in different traditions. So that was a history of truth. And when you come to the Enlightenment period, somewhere around 18th century, of course, Enlightenment happened around 18th century, but slightly before Enlightenment, in the 17th century onwards, we could see that natural sciences makes a kind of a development in the Western world, and which simultaneously started propagating the idea of universal rationality. So the Enlightenment primarily projected this idea, the idea of universal rationality, where truth is conceived as something which is objective and transcendental. I don't have to tell all these things. These are all quite elementary things. I know that being teachers of philosophy, many of you know this. I just want to remind you that, I'm just bringing out this. I'm just making a presentation on all these things, because I'm just trying to prepare a context in which I'm planning to situate my problem. And following this, we could see the developments in science, and the modern concept of science itself. Conceptually, the idea of science was very important in human history, because apart from the idea of knowledge, which was projected by modern sciences, knowledge as something which is universal, objective, and all that, there is another project which science carried out, the project of controlling nature. So this is something which Gadamer emphasizes very strongly in his article, in his paper on truth. So what is meant by this? there is a growing control of nature, the idea of controlling nature, and which means that the aim of science is not just to pursue knowledge, unlike other domains of knowledge. See, for example, in the moral domain, when you talk about moral knowledge, the idea is not to control anyone. Okay, the idea of morality is not to control anyone, but to lead a good life. That has been the traditional assumption. And traditionally, philosophers in various traditions, when they pursued knowledge, knowledge was equated with enlightenment. When they pursued knowledge, the objective of knowledge was some sort of a self-realization, which would elevate you to a higher pedestal of existence. Okay. So, but this has been this idea of truth, this predominant image of truth has been sort of very forcefully, radically replaced by a different idea of knowledge, where modern science, along with its all other assumptions of knowledge and truth, it also projected the very possibility and the idea of controlling nature. The very purpose of science becomes to control nature so that you can make your life better here. So, I mean, these ideas like, creating a new heaven here itself, all these are the part of the grand project of enlightenment. And as Gadamer very brilliantly observes, simultaneously with this idea, this growing idea of controlling nature, we could see that there is an increased uneasiness with culture. Okay, that's where, Gadamer later on very critically evaluates the one of the prejudices of enlightenment. What he says is that it's a prejudice against prejudices. Okay, and he provides a different interpretation of prejudice. Okay, we'll come to that later if necessary. But what is important is that on the one hand there is an idea of control, and on the other hand there is an uneasiness. This is exactly what Gadamer says, his own language. Okay. So it's a bit disturbing that some background noises. Could you please mute those who are not? Excuse me. Could you please others mute the mics, because it's a bit disturbing for me. Excuse me. Could you please mute others? Others, please mute their mics. I find it really disturbing and distracting, the voice in the background. I'm sorry about it. Can the organizers find out from which mic it comes, so that they can directly inform them to switch off, to mute? Are any of these organizers around? Professor Thirmal, are you around? Excuse me. Just make a call. I'm sorry about it, but it is distracting. I'm not able to focus on what I'm saying. Could you please mute those people who are because I'm not able to because there are a lot of distractions. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, so I will continue. Thank you for that. So what I'm going to do is I will just start with the idea of tracing truth in the tradition, or rather tracing truth till what it is there as it is presented by hermeneutics. Okay, so when you see the idea of truth in the ancient Greek world, as I mentioned earlier, the context in which we'll find the discussions, all the major discussions surrounding the concept of truth is metaphysical. And but at the same time, once you find this discussion during Enlightenment, the context in which, the major context in which we find those discussions are epistemological. So you could see a shift from metaphysics to epistemology. Truth also sort of discussed from the domain of, apart from metaphysicians, or rather instead of metaphysicians, it is predominantly became a concern of epistemologists. So it is not no longer treated as a metaphysical idea. And it was during the 19th century, 18th century and 19th century, the question of truth in social sciences became prominent. And this has become very important philosophical idea in the German tradition, the Geisteswissenschaften, where, the idea of human sciences, the sciences of spirit, or human sciences where the question of truth is being raised. And the insights of people like Schleiermacher and William Delphi, all these people become very relevant in this context. Okay, so what happens is that the context in which the idea of truth is discussed here, you could see a kind of overlapping historicism, okay, dominating, which is actually not good, but at the same time, that was a context in which it was discussed. And then what I'll do is that in this presentation, in my presentation, what I'll do is I will also try to sort of situate truth in a slightly different domain, or rather two more domains, or rather three more domains. One is I will try to see the concept of truth from the perspective of human sciences, which Gadamer very explicitly does. Then the truth in the moral truth, the idea of moral truth, which is also presented by Gadamer. And the third one, which I believe is one of the important contributions of Gadamer, where he searches for truth, or he's trying to re-articulate the concept of truth as it is present in art. So art and truth. So it's three aspects or three domains from where you can approach truth: the human sciences, morality or ethics, or moral choices which you make, and the domain of art. And a discussion around these three broad domains, Gadamer arrives at a philosophical notion of truth, a hermeneutic notion of truth, where he equates it with, or rather he says that it's very close to what Heidegger would say. Heidegger would re-articulate the Greek tradition's concept of truth, where he sees it as aletheia, or uncovering, or unconcealedness, or disclosure. Okay, so this is a broad framework in which my talk is situated today. What is happening here is that if you really focus on this different facets of truth, we could see that a different idea of truth is evolving. That is inevitable, because a truth which is understood as something which is conditioned, something which is situated, something which is interpretative, fundamentally interpretative, which probably calls into question some of the, or most of our traditional ideas of truth. Not all, some of the traditional ideas of truth. But when I say traditional idea of truth, what I mean is that the kind of idea of truth which we inherit, or we have inherited from the Enlightenment philosophy, which most of the philosophers in the Western world are, educated in that. So truth becomes, in the hermeneutic context, in the context of hermeneutics, truth becomes allied with, not with metaphysics or epistemology, but rather truth becomes allied with human ontology. So the typical Heideggerian idea of truth, where it becomes a disclosure. Okay, the disclosure of being. And where he brings in language, where Heidegger understands language as a dwelling place of being, where even Dasein also situated. So with the access to truth, one understands oneself. This is the ultimate conclusion which Gadamer arrives at as far as the question of truth is concerned. Okay, so it is in this way. I mean, we'll now start. What I'm going to do now is that there is a dominant concept of truth. I was mentioning about that dominant concept where which we are all familiar with, where it became allied. I mean, a truth which we'll find allied with epistemology. And it's not just epistemology, it's epistemology of science. Okay, so since natural sciences, as I already mentioned, achieve a control of nature, so there is an urge to seek a similar control of the human as well as historical world as far as truth is concerned. I mean, when you search truth in the human sciences, we'll start with that. When you analyze the hermeneutic understanding, when you try to trace the evolution of hermeneutic understanding of truth, we have to actually start with human sciences. So what is happening is that the concept or the idea of knowledge and truth that has been handed over by the tradition, by the dominant epistemological Enlightenment tradition, has been informed by this concept of truth, which is where truth is understood as something which is transcendental, something which is universal, something which is objective, something which is not not influenced by culture or tradition or history or whatever. Where truth is always situated, or rather removed from the very idea of authority. Because authority is a concept which we normally associate with the notion of tradition. Okay, so here we try to very carefully remove it from that idea. So since natural sciences, one of the dominant ways in which we understand natural science is something which enables us, a tool which enables us to control nature. We expect, this is what Gadamer says, we expect a similar kind of control when it comes to human sciences as well, or historical sciences as well. Okay, so I'll just read a quote from Gadamer here. The methods of the natural sciences do not encompass everything that is worth knowing. Okay, not least that which is most worth knowing, namely the final purposes that all control of nature and the human beings must serve. So there is an idea, I mean, he tries to remind us or invoke this idea of, a final purpose. Okay, for which this control is, which actually points to a very ethical question. In the human sciences and philosophy, it is knowledge of another kind and order that one expect. Okay, so this is what, unquote, this is what Gadamer was trying to sort of take us towards. So unlike sciences, what happens here is that where sciences, I've already discussed this, where it seeks to know what is common and universal. In the human sciences, we don't really look for something which is universal and common. Okay, because in, say, for example, in history, when we try to understand the people of Andhra, the people of Andhra or Karnataka in 18th century, we are trying to specify the situation. We are trying to sort of identify, locate a place, a time, and our objective is to understand that particular specific historical event. Okay, so here instead of trying to understand what is common and universal, we are trying to understand the human forms, human expressions which are unique and specific. Okay, so this is the way, the very idea of truth can be legitimized in the context of human sciences. To raise the question of truth in the context of human sciences, we can say that it naturally leads to the question of what method can we adopt. That's the question. That's another question which we need to ask, because the kind of knowledge which we are already familiar with, which is being presented to us, is a knowledge in science, which is always mediated through a method, a definite method. All of us, I mean, this is again a very elementary issue. So naturally, the question of method has become a problem here, and it is in this context, I have already mentioned Schleiermacher's and Deltai's contributions, because Deltai comes up with something which is parallel to Kant's critique of critique of pure reason, something which is parallel to that, and Deltai envisages to come up with a critique of historical reason, where he was actually trying to devise an epistemology for historical sciences or human sciences, Dashes Wissenschaften. And again, one more aspect here becomes prominent, which is more important as far as modern day hermeneutics is concerned, is that, there is this idea of textual meaning, or understanding the textual meaning, or truth in textual understanding. Okay. And the question is, if this methodology is valid or invalid, whatever it is, we have to see what kind of methodology, or how does human sciences reach truth? If it is adopting this methodology, then how is it going to appropriate it? If it is not adopting this methodology, then whether it has its own unique methodology. If yes, how? And here I would like to quote again Gadamer. I quote, "For everything pertaining to memory, imagination, tact, artistic sensibility, and world experience that applies here is obviously of another kind than the equipment which the researcher in the natural sciences requires. But it is not an inferior type of instrument." So this is the point. It is not an inferior type of instrument. There is an instrument of knowledge which is adopted by the human sciences, but nevertheless, that's not an inferior kind of knowledge instrument. One that simply cannot be supplied, but one that grows when one places oneself in the great tradition of human history. So here you could see that, Gadamer is emphasizing on the essential aspect of situatedness, which Heidegger has already mentioned, already indicated in his work. So in one sense, there are people who argue that Gadamer's work is a kind of, Heidegger is more original than Gadamer, but it was Gadamer who urbanized Heidegger. Otherwise, Heidegger is so raw, very difficult to understand. So some of the implications of Heideggerian philosophy, you could see that Gadamer sort of unfolding them by making it directly apply to situations like this. And here, as I mentioned, the emphasis is more on ideas like situatedness, conditionedness, and of course, on the concept of authority, which I believe is one of the central contributions of Gadamer's hermeneutics. The way he has conceived authority, the way he has presented it, the notion of authority. Okay, so here, the essential situatedness of knowledge in the historical sciences, in the human sciences. And definitely, one cannot escape from, as it was indicated earlier, when you approach, your instrument is operative only when your situatedness in specific historical traditions are recognized. Then it is inevitable that one has to allude to the concept of authority. There is no way one can escape this concept. And this is to stand in a tradition in the Gadamerian terms. To stand in a tradition and understand that and recognize that one is essentially conditioned by it, its prejudices, its forward meanings and all that. And here again, I would like to quote Gadamer. I'll just quote it. Okay, this is Gadamer. "Authority does not consist in the superiority of a power that promotes blind obedience and forbids thinking. The true essence of authority is based much more on the claim that it is not unreasonable Indeed, that it can be a command of reason itself to assume that the insight of others who are superior in other matters exceeds your own judgment. So the idea that, there is possible, it is possible to have a different idea, a different concept of rationality or reasonableness. That is one of the major, one of the important contributions of Gadamerian hermeneutics. Because, he is actually elevating certain aspects of human life which was otherwise undermined, completely undermined and neglected by natural sciences. The kind of dominating scientism was exposed by Gadamer in this way. Okay, so that is what he does. So here, I would like to point to certain ancient insights. What Gadamer does here is that, or rather, I'm not just following one the Gadamerian argument here, but I would like to present it as a different way in which what Gadamer probably alludes. Gadamer talks about, or rather he problematizes the concept of knowledge and truth in a different context. He says that, the Greeks probably had a better insight of knowledge, or the Greeks also encountered this concept because they are the most original thinkers in the Western world. So the Greek idea of truth, which one of the ways in which truth was conceived in the Greek world was aletheia, or unconcealedness, which Heidegger claimed to have recovered from the ancient Greek tradition. And this is true, actually. It is definitely a very valid interpretation of Heidegger, that in many ancient traditions, even I feel that even in the Indian tradition also, we could see that truth is being conceived as some sort of unconcealedness, some sort of disclosure. Not just Indian tradition, or traditions rather. In India, we have multiple traditions. But in many of these traditions, and also in other ancient traditions, even the Chinese tradition, you have concepts of truth which are primordially conceived as something which is disclosing itself, which involves a kind of self-knowledge, because the aspect of disclosure would become grossly incomplete without getting substantiated by the idea of self-knowledge. So which you can find in the very strongly present in the Chinese tradition, in the ancient Greek tradition, in the Indian tradition, the Buddhist, the Upanishadic tradition, everywhere, And I was the other day reading Tirumandiram of Tirumula. I don't know, I'm sorry about if I'm pronouncing it wrongly. I got a Malayalam translation, so I'm reading it. Beautiful translation, I believe. Because, though I understand a little bit of Tamil, probably the Tamil which was, in which it was composed, I find it very difficult to understand. So, and here also I could see that it's ultimately amounts to a kind of a notion of truth, which is disclosure. Okay. And the Kural is another example. So almost all these ancient wisdom, when they talk about moral truth, what is the nature of moral truth? The nature of moral truth can never be understood in terms of correspondence, but you need a different idea of truth. You need a different perspective on truth, which definitely is a highly valid perspective. Okay. And that dimension of truth and knowledge is presented. Gadamer actually invokes, or rather points to the Greek ideas of episteme, techne, and phronesis, where, as all of you know, episteme, where he refers to some sort of a theoretical knowledge, which is scientific, fundamentally scientific and all that, or the reality or truth it knows cannot be other than it is. Something which is fixed, something which is out there. Okay. And we are talking about something which is universally present in front of all of us, and it can never be other than what it is. Or cultural appropriations will not change it. But when it comes to techne, as as it is well known, it is the knowledge of the craftsman, where one makes up something, one brings into existence an artifact. It's a contingent coming into being of something, some particular time and place. So it's not, this kind of a knowledge can never be explained with the idea of a theoretical knowledge alone. Of course, that theoretical knowledge is required, but more than that, what is required is a kind of practical skills to make up things. And then the Aristotelian framework also refers to another notion of truth, which is phronesis, which is a moral truth, which can be roughly translated as ethical reason, or rather not translated, described as ethical reasonableness, where you have to make a decision, you have to make a choice. When you try to make a choice, what happens is that you are coming up with a preference. You have a preference of one over another, either this or that. Okay, that's your choice. You say that this is a better course of action than that. So you make a choice, you make a preference, and it is actually responsive to the peculiarities of a particular situation. So one cannot really take away the uniqueness, the specificity of particular situations and focus exclusively on the universal as one does in the theoretical sciences, which is probably present in mathematics in the purest form. But that's not possible here. At the same time, the Greeks also envisages a kind of unity. It's not that the theoretical aspects are absent in phronesis. It is there. It is present in phronesis. That's why when Gadamer reinterprets it, he says that it's the application of the universal in particular. He gives the example of the judge, the concept of justice. The idea of justice is a universal concept. But then when you try to apply this moral ideal of justice into specific particular situations, you need to have a fairly good understanding of the context in which it happens. A certain event has taken place. So that's called practical wisdom. So I've just narrated this. I've just explained this just to show that there was a really broad idea of truth. So Aristotle here talks about the ethical truth. So now from human sciences, I come to the ethical truth, where again, Gadamer actually refers to Aristotle in a major manner. And knowing ethical truth is to know, that is what he says, what is truly the right or wrong thing to do here and now in specific situations. It's not something which is universal. It's not something which happens in an abstract, imaginative domain, but rather the context in which it happens. Your existential context is important. Your ontological situation is important. So every man takes a moral decision from a certain context, from a certain situated background. So it's not something which is accessible via the approach of theoretical or applied sciences, but something which is very different. That is what makes Aristotle's phronesis different from his episteme or technique. So a different approach is inevitable. What it says is that a different disposition of mind in relationship with the idea of truth. That is what is important here. And it's different from episteme, no doubt, and it's not just theoretical. Okay. So when you revisit the idea of knowledge in human sciences, again, at some point of time, we could see that Gadamer refers to the idea of self-knowledge, which is very important. I would rather conclude my entire talk with this notion. The very purpose of this talk is not to present anything very new, but just to make an attempt to understand Gadamer's interpretation of truth, or Gadamer's locating truth in certain contexts where we don't expect it to appear. So that's the idea here. Okay, so Gadamer emphasizes on self-knowledge, but that he does in a different context. He does in a different context in the sense that, knowledge in the human sciences for him involves self-knowledge. Or when you encounter a text, whether it is an artistic text or a historical text or whatever it is, a text is a historically contingent entity which presents itself before you in the form of a knowledge claim and a truth claim. So you encounter the text, or rather you encounter the claims, the truth claims and the knowledge claims of the text from your own situated perspective. So this is basically what hermeneutics is all about. So I quote Gadamer here. I quote, what we know historically is, in the final analysis, ourselves. This is what Gadamer says. What we know historically is, in the final analysis, ourselves. Knowledge in the human sciences always has something of self-knowledge about it, unquote. So basically it tells something about us, but in the case of natural sciences, it doesn't. So the possibility of deception, I mean, this is where he says, you know, when I present an understanding of myself to others, I can also always deceive myself. There is a possibility of deception. If someone asks me to, this is what basically we do when we go for interviews and all. We were asked to say something about us. We can say so many things. Okay. And there is a possibility of deception, Gadamer says. He accepts that. It's so easy and so near in self-knowledge, no doubt about it. But at the same time, in human sciences, what happens is that we encounter a domain of reality which is out there. I mean, out there in the sense which is not something which is there within us, but I mean, this is the way we hit upon self-knowledge. We don't do that. I mean, we do that with the help of something which is in front of us. So that object which is there in front of us, in the human sciences, for example, the text or a historical event, whatever, we are confronted not only with ourselves, but with something else, something which is foreign, something which is unfamiliar, something which raises a truth claim, a knowledge claim, which I'm not very familiar with. So we experience a provocation. Exactly, these are the words of Gadamer. This is Gadamer's words. We experience a provocation from outside that leads us beyond ourselves. So it forces us to take us beyond. And it is here in Truth and Method, Gadamer talks about the question and answer, the logic of question and answer, the dialectics of question and answer and all that, where you know the text is placed in front of the interpreter and the text is approached by the interpreter with a set of questions, but at the same time, simultaneously, the interpreter finds that the text also raises certain questions to him or her. So it's a dialogic process where essentially one encounters question and answers and tries to reformulate the questions again and again. So it's a process which is in principle never ending. So that is why Gadamer says that, you know, every understanding is different. So you encounter a text now and you understand it in a certain way, or your understanding of text that happens now, and you encounter the same text tomorrow. There is no idea of same text, but assume that, you know, for the time being, we encounter the same text tomorrow, it reveals to us in a different manner. So every understanding is different. Not only that different people will understand the text differently, but also the same person may understand the same text differently in different occasions. This is where, you know, the ontological situatedness of understanding becomes relevant, becomes important, because, you know, essentially the textual encounter happens in a language, through a language. And the language is a language of conversation, ideally. The conversation, the dialogic process. The dialogic process initiates a language which is a language of conversation, and every language of conversation is unique to the context to which it happens. So there cannot be the same conversation happening on another occasion. You can't repeat your conversation. Even if two people, the same two people are engaged in conversation, and how much ever they try, they can't repeat their conversation. They will converse, they'll be conversing differently. So different modes of understanding, different modes of exchanging meaning take place, and different modes of disclosures happen in this. So that is why, you know, Gadamer also always emphasizes on truth events. Okay, the events, each event of disclosure is different. So we are constantly challenged by these questions when we encounter text, when we encounter a historical event. We are constantly encountered by new questions. We seek to answer them by getting back to ourselves. How do you answer them? How do you find an answer to the questions which the text raises? but we have no other resources but to search within ourselves. Go back to our tradition, our historical, because that's only place where we can find anything that helps us to make something familiar. So when you encounter a totally unfamiliar knowledge or truth claim, you have to understand it. If you have to understand it, you have to make it familiar. How do you do that? You do that with the help of getting back to yourself, getting back to your historical tradition, getting back to your historical reality, and to a very great extent to your inner self as well. So this process of getting inside of the historical situatedness will reveal certain possibilities of meaning that is hidden in the text. That is why, Heidegger says that there is always a disclosure of meaning and simultaneously a withdrawal of meaning. In every process of understanding involves something which is set and something which is unset. Something which is articulated, something which is not articulated, but it is contained in it, is implied. Okay, which will be revealed later probably. So this is where, we come across disclosures, and I'm taking the other one, the last one, the domain of art, because this kind of a disclosure is more apparent in art, where, the real aletheia happens. We engage in a conversation with the artwork, with a painting or poetry or whatever it is, where the totality of our being is involved, because constantly it forces us to get back into our own historical traditions to make sense of what it is there. So, the essential embeddedness of our being in our language and tradition is reiterated in this context. And when the work of art is encountered, what happens is that on each occasion, when we encounter a work of art, it tells us something which we understand in the light of our horizons of meaning, our tradition, our historical traditions, our cultural tradition. Okay, so we make the otherness of the text or the textual truth familiar by relating it with a familiar terrain. What is that familiar terrain? The pool of meanings which that constitute our being within our tradition. So it is in this sense, sometime back, I would understand what Gadamer referred to as knowledge which is contained in historical sciences is essentially self-knowledge. So aletheia in that sense, or disclosure in that sense, involves self-knowledge, because we are not learning anything new here. Because all learning process is initiated and materialized with a process of turning back, getting back into the historical tradition. So we rather remember, discover what is within the tradition that makes us what we are. This is again Gadamer says, what within the tradition, what is within the tradition, which actually ultimately designed us. We are a product of that. So to discover in the light of a situation we are involved in, the knowledge that is held by you cannot escape what is held by the tradition. We make everything familiar. Doesn't mean that the tradition is a static entity. All of us know that, Gadamer doesn't mean tradition as a static entity. It is something which is very dynamic, and hence it is knowledge that I already have. A self-knowledge is, something, what I'm discovering is that my own, aspect. It's an insight about my own self from a different perspective. So the textual interactions provide me opportunities to discover myself from different perspectives. It's not an abstract theoretical knowledge in that sense, but a concrete practical ability to arrive at an understanding of the text. So this is where, one encounters the text. So truth is understood as aletheia. Heidegger's, Gadamer very explicitly says that, it was Heidegger who raises this question, what is the being of being? It was the original question which Heidegger raised, and then he says that even for Heidegger, this question was, Heidegger never claims that it was his original. He is his originality in raising this question. He says that he actually attributes this question to the ancient Greek thinkers like Heraclitus, Parmenides, and even Plato to some extent. And there is a concept of physis, which or nature, and aletheia or uncontiguousness. They are the original names given for being of beings in the Greek tradition. And so these Greek insights are quite important and relevant for us to understand the ideas presented by Gadamer and Heidegger in that way. So being is truth in its original sense, and the essence of truth itself is disclosure. We can see this in Plato, for example, because in Plato's idea of summum bonum, which is equated as truth, which is equated as goodness. So there is a fundamental identity between all this. Okay, so in ethical truth, for example, this is quite evident where it has to make a choice, as I already mentioned, between this and that. So where, the scientific concept of rationality doesn't work, and we must carry on. Gadamer says in Truth and Method that we must carry it on, or literally translate it from a past world into the world within which we are underway. So we have to we have to relate what we encounter unfamiliar, which is there and presented to us in the historical reality, to our own context. When we interpret a text, this is essentially what happens. So we naturally then do that differently on each occasion. So each time a new interpretation is possible. So we carry over its being from the past and make it present again and again on every occasion. So this is what happens. Okay. And now I'll conclude. Each time we extend its meaning, we discover new meanings, and its disclosure of meaning to us. So in that process, there is a self-disclosure as well. In the process, we rediscover our own being within our own tradition. We are not separating, we are not we are not elevating ourselves from the tradition according to Gadamer, but rather we are finding ourselves, we are rediscovering ourselves within the tradition in an essential manner. It's not good it's not just a process of knowing what is good, but a resolution to do what is good that happens in the case of moral knowledge. Similarly, what happens is that in the process of knowing truth, we are participating, to use a Wittgensteinian term, we are participating in a form of life. So truth disclosures happen in forms of life where we find ourselves as concrete human beings situated. So thank you. I'll stop here, and I would be happy to take questions, but let me tell you, this is just an attempt to understand Gadamer's, some of his ideas about truth. How does he intend to situate truth? There are many other things which I couldn't discuss here. Some of the details also I couldn't discuss here. I was basically focusing on three aspects, as I already mentioned: human sciences, the domain of morality, and art, and trying to present the idea of truth by contrasting what is evolving here with the Enlightenment conception, where truth becomes this, truth came to be discussed predominantly in the context of epistemology. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Any question from audience? Okay.
Can I ask a question? I am K.E. Sadanandan speaking. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yes, please.
Now, the reader is reading the text written by an author, and he is trying to understand that context, the meaning thereof, which was meant by the author. So what I felt is, while listening to you, the reader should have an empathetic attitude. He also should have a cognition of his own cognition. Side by side, he also should have a cognition of the author. Do you agree with that?
See, Gadamerian idea is contrary to this. He doesn't agree with this. What Gadamer basically opposes the very idea of intention of the author. This is one of the initial, one of the primary things which Gadamer makes clear, because when he in his critical evaluation of Scheilmarker and Dilthey, the hermeneutic tradition, where he examines the whole evolution of this tradition from the ancient past. He spends a significant amount of time in discussing Scheilmarker's and Dilthey's interpretation, which is very close to what you said, where the intention of the author, to capture the intention of the author, and adopting an empathetic aptitude and all that becomes important. The problem with this view, according to Gadamer, is that this very idea of adopting an empathetic attitude presupposes, there are two things about it. It presupposes a heavy load of metaphysics, Hegelian metaphysics. Okay. And Dilthey was a Hegelian in that sense, because there is this idea of universal life and all that. So it actually presupposes the possibility of living another person's life, because essentially you and the other person participate in the same universal life, the Geist, which is a Hegelian concept. Okay, that's one problem. Second problem is that this notion of empathizing with the intention of the author actually disowns, it puts down the very idea of situatedness, which is, because it denies the very possibility of, or rather the reality of situated, not possibility, the reality of situatedness, because it assumes that there is nothing called situatedness. You can elevate yourself from all situations and place yourself in a what you call in a bird's eye view kind of, in a God's eye view kind of pedestal, and see things from there, which is sort of very denial of historicity, or rather the historical situatedness. So that is not the Gadamerian idea. So that is the importance of Gadamerian idea. In all this, he is trying to argue that there is a legitimate concept of truth and knowledge possible to be discovered from this context.
I want a clarification also. When you said the term situatedness, you are hearing now?
Yeah, sure. Please.
When you said situatedness, that means the contextuality. Is it similar?
It is not. It is definitely contextuality, because situatedness is originally, I'm using it in the Heideggerian sense here, of course, which was elaborated which was also elaborated by Gadamer with this linguisticality concept. So what I mean by situatedness here is, number one, the historical situatedness in traditions. Number two, the essential linguistic nature of tradition, which Gadamer seeks to repeatedly emphasize. This is what I mean by situatedness. It's not just a context. Of course, it is the context, because this is what your context is. You have no context which is a historical. You always find yourself in contexts which are historically conditioned.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, I am Prasanna Lakshmi.
Sir, good afternoon.
Yeah.
Truth is seeing a different vision.
So,
but how to benefit from truth and to spiritual wisdom. My views. Please give me suggestions, sir.
Can you repeat your question? I didn't get you.
Sir, truth is seeing a different vision, and this is a spiritual wisdom from get truth. But how to give suggestions, sir? Different vision. Truth is a different vision to seeing the people and others.
See, I don't know about that.
Spiritual says how to adapt it, the truth, sir. How to practice.
I don't know whether you would be able to ever justify a spiritual notion of truth from the Gadamerian perspective, the way in which you want it to. The problem is that you have a very strong notion of spirituality, which is very difficult to get appropriated to this tradition. That's the problem. If it is a broad concept of spirituality, then it's fine. You know, you can probably interpret it with the Heideggerian notion and all. But since I understand that your notion of truth is quite strong, I don't know how you would really, I mean, unless I
Sir,
really...
I am Prasanna Lakshmi calling.
Please ask one by one, please.
Sir, I am Prasanna Lakshmi calling.
Okay.
Sir, actually, I wanted to know, when we are reading a text in philosophy, so how I can understand the underlying meaning in that?
See, it's not just philosophy. Any text, we understand. I mean, if you follow the Gadamerian insight, we have a certain way in which we encounter the text. It's not that, you know, there is one single way of reading it or one single form of reading it. As Gadamer says, you know, that's quite true, you know, because I could still remember when I really started reading Gadamer's Truth and Method years ago when I was doing my doctoral studies in way back in 90s, early 90s. The way in which I understood is very different, but than what I understand it today. But doesn't mean that, you know, it was wrong then and now I am right. Not in that way. Okay. And every day it is, I mean, it's a matter of personal experience as well. For many of us, I'm sure that the same text, when you read again and again, new meanings will be revealed. That's because, you know, your unknown terrains in your, I mean, not very conscious terrains in your inner self are being activated, or rather, I mean, they raise certain questions. And to use Gadamerian language, certain questions emanate from those terrains, which will get back, I mean, which will hit the text and get back with some answers, which are self-disclosures. So in that process, you know, every understanding involves a kind of disclosure where it tells you something specifically. So unless you start reading the text from your context, how much ever ignorant it is, how much ever innocent it is of philosophy, you will never understand it. You have to start with that. Then it's a process which goes on.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
May I ask a question, sir?
Yeah, sure. If Dr. Thirumal permits.
Yeah,
Okay, it's the final question, please.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Sir, I was reading The Mirror of Nature of Rorty, and he has mentioned Gadamer, frequently. So he has not taken Dilthey, he has not taken any inspiration from Dilthey and all other hermeneutic thinkers, but Gadamer he has mentioned many times. So what? Because I do not have very deep insight into Gadamer's own thoughts. So what makes him so special, sir, to be discussed in Rortian thought?
See, Rorty understands himself as a pragmatic thinker who belongs to the post-Nietzschean tradition. So he says that his major influences come from three directions. One is Heidegger, the other one is Wittgenstein, the third one is the pragmatic tradition of William James and all that. So the American pragmatism, the continental hermeneutic tradition, and or rather hermeneutic phenomenological tradition, and then the Wittgensteinian tradition. So these are the three influences which he counts as important. And Rorty himself is a person who gives a lot of, who emphasizes a lot on what you call anti-foundationalism, what is known as anti-foundationalism. He's one of the most celebrated anti-foundationalist thinkers of 20th century. So he probably was looking at philosophical justification for this anti-foundationalism where Gadamer's hermeneutics is one of the most lucid forms of anti-foundationalism present in the 20th century philosophy. So that's the reason. And Dilthey and Scheilmarker's philosophy, I mean, they are not primarily philosophers, first of all, like Gadamer. Second thing is that they are foundationalist thinkers. They were trying to situate meaning in a fixed domain, in a historical domain, while Gadamer was emphasizing on the historicity, the historical situatedness of meaning, which is quite anti-foundational. So it's quite natural that a philosopher like Richard Rorty, who was primarily an anti-foundationalist, would find Gadamer's writings quite interesting. So that is.
Gadamer's writings give give direction for anti-foundationalism.
Yes, definitely. And I would say more than Gadamer, of course, he refers to Gadamer quite frequently, but more than Gadamer, I think Rorty was more directly influenced by Heidegger.
Thank you so much.
He has some specific essays dedicated to in his 5-volume, essay collections. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you for giving this opportunity, and
thank you for your wonderful presentation. Yeah.
And I must also thank you that slowly people in Tamil Nadu are trying to recognize me. Consider me as someone who works here. Okay, because hardly that interaction is very limited for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe we'll start more fruitful interactions from hereafter. Thank you for that, Dr. Tinmar.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, sir. Your nice presentation.
Dear participants.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, please. Okay, thank you. This is the final session. Professor Dr. V. Suresh is going to present his lecture on understanding mind, philosophical and scientific considerations. Actually, he is my mentor, my friend, philosopher, and a guiding source for me. I welcome you, sir. Sir, unmute. Sir, please unmute.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Tirman.
Sir, yes, please. Before I invite Dr. Bharani to introduce our professor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good afternoon to one and all. I am very much happy to introduce today's webinar's fourth session resource person, Dr. V. Suresh, Professor of Psychology. He is an eminent Professor of Psychology, and he is known very well popularly as man of principle or man of ideal, especially in keeping time, punctuality. He has a rich experience of nearly 40 years, 38 years of teaching and research experience. And he has also guided as many as PhD, MPhil and MSc. He has conducted 4 national conferences and 2 workshops. He has attended as many as seminars, conferences, symposia and workshops. He has completed 1 major research project and generated funds to the university. In journals, he has published 10 articles in national journals and 4 articles in internationally reputed journals. So all these, with all these academic credentials, we are very much happy that Dr. V. Suresh, Professor of Psychology, is with us. So on behalf of organizing committee of this webinar, we welcome you, sir, to this session. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the nice words. Right. Are you able to see the slides?
No, sir, no.
No? Okay, just a minute.
Sir,
Yes, sir.
sir, now you are the co-host. Yeah.
Okay.
You can share.
Is it visible or no?
No, sir.
No?
No.
Okay, just a minute. Not it. Not it.
No.
Just 1 second, please, sir. Just wait for a minute. I'll start.
Okay. No issue.
On the screen, slides. Slides.
Sir, yes, sir.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
That's fine. Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you for friends.
Okay.
From the morning, you have been listening to lectures from experts in the field of philosophy, and basically, I am from the field of psychology. And the topic of this program, philosophy, science, and technology, is, I feel, is a very pertinent one for the present day society, because I feel that the philosophical aspects are being neglected and science is taking a prominent role, leaving philosophy in the background, and not only leaving philosophy in the background, also making human beings weak. As a result, I thought this topic should help us in strengthening not only a philosophical orientation to scientific approach, but also in empowering human minds. So I am trying to see the impact of philosophy, science, and technology on the human mind, and how the human mind could be understood better in integrating these three. And philosophy, as you all know, is the rational, abstract, and methodical consideration of reality as a whole. See, when you most of you are from the philosophy background, and you know that philosophy approaches things as a whole, not in a molecular form, but as a whole. That is why many people find philosophy difficult. Not only difficult, unfortunately, people find philosophy useless, but actually it is the one which integrates everything together. And to take things from a philosophical point of view, I would say, psychologically speaking, it requires a high level of intellect in a human being. So it also tries to understand the fundamental dimensions of human existence and experience. So on the one side, the dimensions of human existence, the other one, experience, because our philosophical system says that the external world is not real. Then what is real? Your experience is real. As a result, there is a need to understand the experiences of our own self, and for which I think science has to help and philosophy should provide the support. Now, when you see science in the simplest language, it is the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. So science is the pursuit of application of knowledge. So knowledge has to be acquired and applied, and understanding of the natural and social world. How do we understand? By following a systematic methodology based on evidence, which means we need to understand that things have to be approached in an integrated manner, not in a just in a molecular manner. As you gain information in a molecular way, you'll have to integrate them. You should not simplify, but unfortunately, that is what has happened in the present day life situation. And adopt a systematic methodology. So when you say systematic methodology, where you try to minimize the errors through appropriate procedures. So in that respect, I would say both philosophy and science, their goal is the same. So their goal is to attain or to understand the truth or understand reality. So philosophy and science are not contradictory as many people seem to believe. So they go together, and I would say philosophy should provide the foundation for science. So when you say science, it is an approach. It is not the label for something. It is the approach. And the popular concept of science now is modeled upon physical sciences, which rely exclusively on objective data. And scientific methodology includes objective observation, measurement, and data. So it is an approach, right, from the beginning till the end, how you approach and how objective you are and how you try to minimize the errors is an important aspect. But unfortunately, again, what has happened is, because philosophy has been minimized, the role of philosophy has been minimized in the present day world. The popular concept of science believes that many people believe that you need to provide a proof which should be available to their senses. So your senses cannot understand everything. It can provide only the input, and only your mind has to provide. That is where philosophy plays an important role. And we look for proof for every small thing outside rather than inside. And the physical sciences have developed enormously. On the other side, the behavioral sciences, human sciences have not grown at the same pace. The reason is that, I would say, as a psychologist, the reason is that we focus more and more on the outside world. We are able to identify procedures or methodology with which we are able to prove things in the outside world. So as you focus more and more on the outside world, you become psychologically, you become more skilled in understanding the outside world, and you fail to spend time to explore the inner world. And that is the reason why the human element has been sidelined now. And the external world, the outside world, is considered to be reality in the present day world. So as you focus predominantly on the outside world, which keeps changing from time to time, so outside world in the context of Indian philosophical system is not real, it is only an illusion, whereas we feel that that is reality. So ultimately, in many respects, our way of looking at things, our perceptions are distorted. Like the examples usually that I give is, 40 years ago, when you say your child is taking up a tuition, people used to think that, well, he's a dull-headed child, that is why he requires extra help. Whereas today, when your child does not take a tuition, then people say that probably something is wrong with him. Now, which one is true? There is a distortion of reality, and we give importance to the examination marks rather than the knowledge the student has gained. So it is in that sense, we are focusing more and more on the external world. And as a result, people believe that physical sciences are only can be called as sciences, the other ones are not called sciences. So we give importance to the outward aspect. That's why many times, say, for example, our course in psychology, earlier it was called as MA in psychology. Then many people came and asked us, why don't you change it as MSc in psychology? Then I told them, well, whether it is MA or MSc, psychology is psychology. Why do you want the label? No, sir, if it is MSc, it is a science. Otherwise, it is not a science. So people look at only the label. Superficially, we look at it rather than go deep into that. The reason is the intellect has been weakened. That is why I felt that I need to focus on a psychological concept of mind and try to see the impact of philosophy, science, and technology here. Now, coming to the philosophy of science, scientific inquiry requires an attitude of critical rationality with efforts to eliminate errors in perceptual or experimental observations and reasoning. So, I'm repeating here, it is a scientific inquiry requires an attitude. So an attitude is within the human being. So whatever procedure you adopt for the outside world, ultimately it is processed within the individual. An attitude of critical rationality with efforts to eliminate errors in finding out the truth in perceptual or experimental observations and reasoning. Whereas nowadays, what happens is many researchers, unfortunately, I see that their hypothesis are to be, all the hypotheses in their research are to be proved. As a result, they try to do something to prove their hypothesis. They don't feel that a hypothesis is only an assumption. So an attitude of critical rationality is not there. Why? Because they become attached to their idea, to their hypothesis here, which makes them blind to the objectivity of research, scientific inquiry. And so methodology of science is the well-known hypothetical deductive model. So you form hypothesis and then you, through deductive model, you try to eliminate errors and arrive at the truth, which has 5 stages, which we'll see next. And the nature of phenomena, investigative techniques, and the number of variables. So it varies from problem to problem, discipline to discipline, field to field, etc. So the investigative techniques can vary from one field to the other. But unfortunately, what happens here is, say, for example, in psychology, they use more of investigative techniques or gadgets which are used to study the physical aspects, the physical world. Whereas the tools of the mind should be different, and where the tools adopted for understanding the physical world cannot be appropriate. That is what is happening. Like, say, for example, the brain scan, EEG, etc. They make inferences based on these aspects. So that way, that is why I feel that there should be a course on, I request all the philosophy departments in this context, there should be a course on philosophy of science, especially to the students of physical sciences, because they don't understand the philosophy behind that, and ultimately they go into the identification of the, or exploring the physical world, but they don't understand the philosophical aspects to that. Whereas there should be a philosophical aspect which will give you the right attitude toward scientific inquiry. So once when I was in the psychology department in our university, the head of the department of physics called me and said, well, can we have an optional subject of counseling psychology for our students? Then I suggested, well, rather than having a paper on counseling psychology, why don't you give them a paper on yoga? Because that will help them to understand the inner reality and the outer reality, find a balance between the two. So that is how it should be. And that is where I feel that all the students of research or science, especially physical sciences, should have a course, a full-fledged course on the philosophy of science, where they should understand what it is and how to approach the world in a objectively a scientific way. Now, coming to the stages in the methodology of science, the first one is rigorous observation of facts, often with the aid of instruments or experiments. So the instruments or experiments are only tools which enhance the accuracy of your observation. So that is where, well, the instruments can be only facilitative or supportive in nature. In addition, subjective phenomena accessible to conscious awareness also constitute as data. So it is not necessarily the outside information that an instrument gives you, but also the data that is available to your awareness, to your consciousness, that should also be form a part of the data. In which case, in many aspects of research, this is not accepted so easily. And it's based on certain qualities or patterns in the observed facts. That is, we try to see a common pattern in the facts that we observe, and based on that, one or more verifiable hypotheses are generated, either by logical reasoning or intuitive inspiration. Again, if you see here, based on, you see a pattern and a sort of interrelationship in the facts that you have observed or you have encountered or that you have experienced. Based on that, you try to integrate them and form verifiable hypothesis. So when you say verifiable, where you can adopt a methodology or a procedure to test that. So either by logical reasoning or intuitive inspiration. So intuition again is not something baseless. Intuition is based on your experience. Only thing, the difficulty with intuition is you are unable to convince others, because the others try to see things only from a logical perspective, whereas intuition tries to keep all available data simultaneously in arriving at something. So that is where it's difficult to convince. That doesn't mean intuition is wrong, intuition is baseless. That is not the case at all. And these hypotheses are verified as true or false by more observations or experiments designed for the purpose. Again, I would suggest there may be many research scholars who will be listening to this lecture. I'd be telling them that if your hypothesis is not proved, that means, well, it's not that your knowledge is wrong. That is not the case. Maybe your assumption was wrong. Try to explore where your assumption was wrong. Then you try to gain much more knowledge, more authentic knowledge. So don't try to see that your hypothesis should be somehow be proved. That need not be the case. And the results are reviewed and interpreted to form tentative conclusions. Again, even as the previous speaker also was mentioned, the conclusions that you arrive at through your scientific research, they are not final, they are tentative, because there are certain limitations in your exploration, and as a result some aspects you would have left unexplored and somebody else may incorporate it. As a result, it may either be disproved or it may be refined, it may be improved, etc. So based on that, a theory is proposed or earlier explanations are modified. And greater the number of consequences of a hypothesis that are verifiable and found true, greater is the probability of hypothesis being true. That is, when the number of consequences are more and the number of hypotheses or more number of hypotheses are found to be true, then the greater, because when the number of consequences are more, that means you have explored it from various angles, from various points of view, different points of view you have incorporated. As a result, it is likely to be true. Whereas when you make it simple, then what you find today, tomorrow it is rejected. That is what is happening in the present day society, because present day we are trying to make things as simple as possible. Scientific approach in the present day society has made things simple, but simple doesn't mean right. It is easier for us to understand because your brain need not be squeezed to understand that. As a result, you convince yourself saying that it is simple, and as a result it is right, which actually is not the case. That is where again I feel that philosophy should be the base, and all people who try to understand science should have knowledge on the science of philosophy. So these are the stages in the methodology of science. Now, as a student of psychology, I prefer to talk on the concept of mind from a philosophical as well as from a scientific perspective, and the importance of integrating these approaches. And the philosophical system and the Indian philosophical system also have rich information on the concept of mind. And the important thing is, psychology as a branch emerged in the West, but there are psychological understanding or conceptions in the Indian philosophical system. Say, for example, if you see the science of yoga, the central concepts in yoga are the concept of mind and the concept of consciousness. So by training the mind appropriately, you expand the consciousness. That is the goal of yoga. That's what they teach. So as a result, I thought that I can focus on the concept of mind, because the mind is the central aspect in our actions which need to be understood in a scientific manner, and where we can find ways of strengthening the mind, empowering the mind, so that we will be able to understand both our inner self as well as the outer in a better manner. So if you see the general concept, philosophical conceptions of mind, mind occupies a prominent place in Indian philosophical system. The Western system has rejected the concept of mind, the psychological field. Whereas in the Indian philosophical system, the mind has a prominent place. And all the systems believe that the mind is a complex cognitive process. So the elements of mind are varied cognitive processes, like your learning, your thinking, your imagination, etc. And the mind is not a physical entity. As a result, it cannot be directly observed. That is one of the difficulties in convincing people to study mind. Because when you say mind, where is mind? Like when you ask an Indian to touch his mind and tell you, he touches the heart and tells. Whereas when you ask a Westerner to touch his mind and tell you, he touches the head and tells you, where is the mind now? So the people enter into a controversy right now, and as a result, there is an argument that the mind exists or does not exist, etc. That is how it goes on. So it cannot be directly observed, but its dynamics can be inferred. You make inferences through our experiencing of feelings, perceptions, thinking, remembering, and so on. That means to understand yourself or to understand the external world, ultimately to understand the truth, it is essential to understand the dynamics of the mind. So we need to adopt proper procedures to understand our experiences. Why I feel happy in one situation, why I feel happy in another situation. One person is happy, another person is critical of me, etc. So the various aspects, so that we can only make an inference about the existence and functioning of the mind. And the mind is conceived of comprising a series of mental states, not just one, a series of mental states that cognize their objects. The objects are only elements for the mind to function on. That is why the Indian philosophical system says objects are not real, your experience is real. Like when you listen to, let's say, my speech, one person may think that, well, the speech is really good. Another person may think that the speech is really bad. What is real now? For him, for one person, the speech is good is real. For another person, the speech is bad is real. So it is predominantly based on our experience. But rather than looking at it, what we do is we interpret it from the point of view of external world, because the focus is on the outside world. Like when someone gives you a sweet, you eat the sweet and you like the sweet taste. But what do? You say the sweet is good. The sweet is what it is. Just because it created a pleasant feeling in you, then you attribute the goodness to the sweet, not to your feeling here. So that is where it leads to a series of mental states, and the objects are only helpful for the mind to understand and cognize. Now here, to explain the philosophical conception of mind, I just considered three views: the Samkhya view, the yoga system, and Abhidharma tradition. Though there are all the systems have rich information on the concept of mind, all of them cannot be considered. So I've just taken just three. Now, coming to the Samkhya view, mind involves a non-material spiritual element called self. Now, it involves a non-material. So you cannot look for a structure of mind in the body of an individual. It is a non-material spiritual element. When I say spiritual, I look at it as a student of psychology. So when you say spiritual, many people believe that when you say spiritual, that means God. Well, not necessarily. God is an element, only an element with regard to the spiritual aspect. When you say spiritual, you try to integrate various aspects, try to see it in a things in a broader perspective. So, uh, so there is a spiritual element called the self. So it is the self which experiences, which is the self which integrates all your experiences, etc. The self is a state that does not undergo changes. Because if it undergoes changes, it cannot understand or realize the changes outside around it. So the self remains the same, but it is able to observe the changes around it. And it is a conscious presence, an important aspect. When you say conscious presence, then you know that this is what is happening. So, conscious presence that witnesses the experiences derived from the world of diversity. So, the outside world has variety, diverse elements in the outside, and when an individual experiences them, he or she is conscious of their presence. Yes, I'm encountering this, I'm facing this, I'm seeing it in this way. I don't like this person, I'm angry at this person, I'm happy with this person, or I like this particular object, etc. So when you are conscious of that, then you know why it is happening, what it has created such a feeling in you, and accordingly you can correct. On the other hand, when you are not conscious, what happens is you attribute it to the outside element rather than to the inside. So, this is the central aspect which makes it conscious with regard to the presence of the objects. And mental activity starts with intellect called buddhi, which consists of the ability to distinguish and experience objects, which means this can be developed, this can be strengthened only based on your encounter with the diverse objects in the external world. So you are able to compare, you are able to distinguish, and you are able to experience various aspects here. And it is the locus of all the fundamental predispositions that lead to these experience. So the self is the locus of all the predispositions, fundamental predispositions. It is where all the predispositions are located. That is why I said it is the integrating center, and that leads to the experience. Say, for example, when you have your pencil on your table, and when I take the pencil and I break it, you are unhappy. Sometimes you are angry at me. So you are experiencing anger. Why are you experiencing anger? Not because of the cost of the object. That is not the case at all. The cost is immaterial for you. You believe that the object is in some way related. Related to what? Is it related to your hand? Is it related to your eyes? Related to your nose? No, it is related to the self. So you feel it is, in a sense, some way related to you, and as a result, you are upset. Whereas when I take my pencil and break it, well, you are not upset there. You just say, silly fellow, and you keep going. So that is where it is the locus of all the experiences. And the intellect is active. So when there are diversity outside or inside, when you experience that, then your intellect is active, understanding about them, assimilating the elements, integrating the elements, etc., and expanding your knowledge. So the intellect is not passive, which means, psychologically speaking, you need to keep the intellect, stimulate the intellect. For that, diversity is essential. When you simplify things, your intellect becomes passive, and ultimately your thinking, your remembering, your learning, everything becomes inferior. The self illuminates objects which aid the intellect in distinguishing them. So the self only indicates the presence of the object, and it is the intellect which distinguishes them through the various process. And the intellect takes on the form of an object and reflects the self. Now, what happens here is the intellect actually merges with the object, takes the form of the object, and reflects the self. What it implies here is when you give me, say, for example, a picture, I say the picture is beautiful. What it implies is that the self of mine enjoys this type of an object, this type of a painting. So it reflects the self. So whatever you do, actually it is a reflection of your own self. Like when you say the lecture is good, what does it imply? You like this style of lecturing. That's what it implies. So it is a reflection of the self. So the intellect takes on the form of the object which reflects the self. That is the Samkhya view of the self. Coming to the mind in the yoga system. So in the yoga system, again, as I told you, the central concept is the mind. So according to the yoga system, the mind is the sum of the cognitive abilities that enable consciousness, perception, memory, etc. And it is the cause of our thoughts and actions. The mind is the cause of our thoughts and actions. That's why sage Patanjali says that thinking takes place in your mind and your suffering takes place because your mind is thinking. So that is the cause of suffering according to Patanjali, which means when you can train your mind to be one pointed, to be still on an object without wandering or without wavering, suffering can be eliminated. So that is how, in the yoga system, the mind is a tool which helps in the expansion of consciousness. And in Patanjali's conception, there are three components of the mind. One is manas, which involves recording the impressions received through the senses from the outside world. So, manas is the one which brings you into contact with the external world. Through the sense organs, we receive impressions, information. So it is this one, this component, which connects you to which brings you into contact with the external world. Then information goes to the second element or component, the buddhi, which indulges in classification and analysis of the impressions and reacting to them. So what happens here is the buddhi actually processes the information, classifies based on your earlier knowledge and the present information, etc., analyzes the various elements in them, and then the impressions and reacts to the impressions. How you react? You react with anger, you react with happiness, etc. And the third aspect, so through buddhi, you are able to gain knowledge. And the third component is ahamkara, which claims this impression for its own. So it claims this information as its own and stores them up as one's knowledge. So once it is taken in, then it becomes my knowledge. So far, the first one, the external world provided the input. Then what happens? My buddhi actually processes the information and then assimilates and accommodates, integrates, etc. Everything takes place. Now it becomes my knowledge. So as a result, I claim that it is my knowledge, and such a knowledge occurs in the third component of the mind. And as a result, Patanjali believes that the mind has to be trained in the right direction. So what happens here is the mind is clear at the beginning, but as distorted things happen in your experiences happen in your life, well, the one layer after the other actually gets accumulated over the mind, and as a result, the mind becomes blurred, it becomes distorted in nature. So that is where he believes that these layers are to be eliminated so that the mind can be clear, it can focus on the right thing. When it is focused on the right thing, then ultimately your actions will be right, and ultimately the end result will also be appropriate, real. Now, the earlier example that I give you here, which is a common problem in our present day society now. Now, that is one thing where many of us feel that examination is stressful. As a result, there is an argument that examinations are to be eliminated during the primary stage, during the secondary stage, or during the college stage also, etc. So There is an argument here. But the thing is, why is examination stressful? We never think of that. Examination per se is not stressful. That is where there is a layer of the mind which actually has distorted your mind. Examination per se is not stressful. Then what is stressful? The undue importance or importance that we give to the examination mark is the cause of the stress. Examination per se is not the cause of the stress. What is the goal of the examination? You conduct the examination after the student undergoes the classes or the teaching, which means you try to test whether the student has acquired the knowledge. So the goal of examination is to test whether the student has acquired the knowledge that was given to him by the teacher. So which means you must be welcoming examinations, you must be happy about examinations as often as possible. But unfortunately, what happens here is, from the knowledge point of view, you have gone to the external criteria of the examination mark. So you think that the examination mark reflects the knowledge of the student. So as a result, it is easier for you to assimilate the examination mark rather than to look at the knowledge of the student here. So it's simple, it's easy, it is convenient. As a result, you come to the conclusion, if you get good marks, that means you have acquired knowledge. Then ultimately it has gone to the extent on the one side, you are not happy with the examination system. At the same time, you continue to attach too much importance to the examination mark. Even a difference of 1 mark between two students is a humiliating experience for not only for the student, but also to the parent. That is why the parents become stressful here. On the other hand, if the examination is conducted and then the papers are corrected, a feedback is given to the student as to where you have learned, where your learning is right, and where you have done very good, and where you have learned wrongly, why it is wrong, etc. When that is explained, then the student knows where I need to improve, what needs to be improved, etc. Naturally, he will be motivated to learn, and ultimately he will be waiting for the examination. Now think, why is it that the parents, the children, the teachers are afraid of examination? The reason is our mind is looking at it in a wrong way, and sometimes we adopt a shortcut to get our child a high examination mark also, rather than make him understand the subject matter. But that is not going to keep him sustained in the long run, which we don't understand. So that is where in many respects our perceptions are distorted, the mind has become weak. So that is where the mind, it is a high time that the mind of human beings are to be strengthened. Now coming to the next tradition, the Abhidharma tradition. According to this, mind is a complex cognitive process involving a succession of related momentary mental states. So, which means when there is a trigger, a stimulus, there is a series of cognitive process which are momentary in nature. One leads to another mental state. So they are momentary in nature. That is why many times when you don't focus on them, when you are not aware of them, later on you deny the experience. Like when you are angry at somebody, you show the anger and then you say, you have made me angry. So when it is not discussed, when that is discussed after about a week, the person says, well, I was not angry that day at all. I was just upset. I was not angry. You deny reality. So many times. Whereas on the other hand, if you are skilled in observing a scientific attitude, if you are skilled in observing the series of mental states, so naturally you will be able to understand yours. So that's what it is. And elements of mind are those mental states arising in quick succession, which means what are the elements of mind? What is it that we need to understand? We need to focus on and try to understand objectively the quick succession of these mental states, what actually triggers, what leads to one and then to the other, etc. So it leads to many other aspects. Like for example, if you see in this sense a marital problem, the problem between the husband and the wife, no one is born an enemy. So they started life with all thrills and excitement. But subsequently, what happens after some time, differences crop up. What is difference? Each one is brought up in a particular way, and as a result, each one's way of looking at things is in a particular angle, which the person does not understand the angle of the other person, and ultimately that leads to a difference between the two individuals. So it's only a difference in perception. It is not the two individuals are good or bad, and they keep on arguing with each other, they keep on fighting with each other. Why? I argue that I am right, the other person argues that she or he is right, and ultimately we don't try to see the other person's perspective. That's why empathetic understanding, I try to put myself in the other person's position and see why that person is interpreting that way, etc. I need to see. Instead, what happens here, I get disturbed and it causes unpleasantness, and ultimately it leads to an argument where the main issue gets sidelined and it ends up in unpleasantness, and one unpleasantness leads to another unpleasantness, and ultimately we tend to believe that, well, marriage is full of problems. That's how we look at it. Whereas, on the other hand, if you can understand this sequence of mental states, then you know how to handle them, how to correct them, and how to benefit from them, etc. So we gain understanding of mind only by directly looking at an experience. So you need to focus on, it is not the other people coming and explaining it to you. 90% of it we don't accept at all. That is why psychologist once mentioned, when you are a child, you are controlled by everyone. When you grow into adolescent stage, where there is an optimum level of development and growth, you see that the whole world is wrong, because during adolescent stage the person is very idealistic in nature. So he thinks that the whole world is wrong, which needs to be corrected. Then when the person grows a little bit older, gets married, tries to control the life partner, and then when he or she gets a child, tries to control the child. Then when he gets old, he realizes that he can control change nothing but himself. Had he realized it when he was young, life would have been much better. So we gain understanding only by directly observing our own experience. That is why generally a practice is given. When I commit a mistake, I am taught to say sorry. The idea is that my mistake was unintentional. I didn't do it intentionally. Now, when I realize that I have committed a mistake, I have hurt an individual by my behavior, I feel sad about it. To express the sadness, I say sorry. So, I should not commit the mistake again if I really feel sad. And when I feel sad, when I look at it, when I experience that, so my unhappiness is not because of the other individual, because it is because of my action which I did not foresee. So next time I need to foresee. I correct my behavior. I modify my behavior. So when I modify my behavior, naturally my mind gets strengthened. So when I understand that, when I wholeheartedly accept my mistake, I say sorry, I correct. Whereas many of us keep saying sorry and committing the same mistake. Why? We have been taught to say sorry, not to feel sorry. We don't understand our own self properly. So it is not by studying the mind as an object, but attending to its external manifestations. Well, these are not enough. You need to understand the inner experiences. So each mental state depends on the preceding mental state. Which means what you need to understand is, when if you are angry now, you must go back, try to see what actually triggered your anger, then what actually triggered that particular state, etc. So each mental state depends on the preceding mental state, which forms a continuum. And each mental state has two aspects. One is awareness. You become aware of something, and cognitive and affective engagement and characterization. So awareness of the presence of something is one. The other one is your understanding of the properties of the object and how you feel, etc. So the cognitive and affective engagement and how you characterize. So how you characterize is, say for example, there is a teacher. Usually what we teachers do is, we like students who are good in their studies, and we don't like students who are not good in studies. Why is that? The reason is that you tend to believe that student who gets good marks actually has proved that you are a good teacher. So you tend to interpret it that his good mark is because of your teaching, and as a result you feel good about him. That is one. The other one is he is the one who makes your job easy. When you explain it once, he understands, and then you can proceed further. On the other hand, the student who fails, why has he failed? Well, he has failed because he has some sort of inadequacy, maybe a lack of motivation, maybe a little bit of lower in intelligence or whatever. And as a result, he is the person who requires more of your attention. So if that student has got good marks because of your teaching ability, that means still there is inadequacy in your teaching ability. If you see it as a challenge, then you help the student. When he is able to do well, you feel a sense of achievement in you. Yes, I have become a better teacher. So it is the poor student who made you feel that you are a better teacher now. Whereas on the other hand, when you look at it that way, when you see it as a challenge, you enjoy doing that. Whereas when you see it as a problem, you try to avoid it. That is when you feel unhappy on seeing the student, you experience unpleasantness on seeing the student, etc. And as a result, you deny responsibility for his failure. So mental states are not only aware of the objects, but also actively engage the objects. And it can be observed by turning inwardly and focusing on the way we feel, perceive, think, remember, etc. So, which means you can understand the mind only by focusing yourself inward. Look within. What makes you angry? What makes you pleasant? Why is it that I have remembered it in a wrong way? Then what makes something pleasant for me, etc. Try to focus on that. Why is it that I like this? Why is it that I don't like this? Try to understand what is called as introspection. So introspection in the scientific field was rejected because it is difficult. There are limitations, true, but that doesn't mean introspection is useless. That is not the case, but that is how many people have looked at it. And as a result, in psychology also, introspection was rejected long back. But philosophy here, that's where I come. Philosophy here should help people to develop the skill of introspection so that science can incorporate introspective aspects also for understanding reality in a better way. Now, that is with regard to the conception of mind from a psychological perspective, a philosophical perspective. Now, coming to the psychological perspective, as I told you earlier, psychology as a branch of knowledge emerged in the West. So whatever we study in psychology today in our country also is only a Western origin. It has not incorporated the Indian system. So that is where I feel that there's nothing called Indian psychology separately, but the Indian philosophy is very rich in psychological material. You'll have to cull out, make use of them. And it can solve many human problems, whereas Western psychology is inadequate, about which I'll talk later. So psychology applies scientific methodology. So the procedures it tries to adopt, that is why psychology is called as a science. And it formulates theories, tests hypotheses through observation and experiment, and analyze the findings with statistical techniques. And the raw data for such a scientific approach is human behavior. So human behavior is the raw data. So how you act in the outside world is the raw data for behavior. Because psychologists in the West, when the field emerged, they said that what could be observable should be the subject matter of psychology. So what is not observable, well, they could not study it in a scientific way, but at the same time, we cannot reject them completely saying that they are useless, which is not the case. So human behavior is the raw data for the study of psychology. So psychology adopts many methods. Some of them are introspection. The earliest method that psychology adopted was introspection, because psychology emerged from philosophy. So, which focuses on the processes and activities that occur as people experience the world around them. But at the same time, the method has its own limitation, like subjectivity, my own distorted perception, etc. And as a result, people have difficulty in making use of this method. I won't say the method is useless. It has to be sharpened, it has to be developed further in the system. The second one is observation, systematic registering of events. Now, when I observe, what should happen is I must objectively record information. But if my perception is distorted, my recording of observation is going to be distorted here. Again, philosophy has to help people in objective observation. Then the third one is experiment, which studies the effect of one variable on the other by deliberately manipulating and controlling the other variables. Now, what happens here is it tries to study the cause and the effect. But this method, again, though psychologists have been trying to use that, it's quite difficult. The reason is, in a physical science, it is possible to control other variables. Whereas with regard to the mind, controlling of variables is difficult. As a result, using experimental method is becoming a challenge for psychologists also. Now, coming to the comparison of the psychology of the West and the East. As far as the Western psychology is concerned, the world of society is reality. That is, the outside world is reality, which is not the case as far as the Eastern psychology. And normal behavior in terms of Western psychology is conformity with the accepted rules of the society. So the rules of the society are the determining substance. You will have to modify your behavior in accordance with the outside world. But what happens here is, this is not an appropriate way. Well, then I keep on modifying to fulfill the norms of the outside world. What happens to my own needs, my own requirements, my own feelings, etc.? Well, that way, that explanation doesn't seem to be satisfactory. Now, when you come to the Eastern psychology, it believes that our true nature is far more superior. Each one of us is born with our own nature, which is similar to the external world. So the universe, we are a part of the universe. So the universe has a pattern. The same pattern is existing in every human being also. So it rests in one's own nature. And instead of the world controlling you, you begin to control the world. So what happens here is, when you say you begin to control the world, you try to understand your needs, your requirements, what makes you act in a particular way, and how the outside world should be. For that to happen, there should be a harmony between you and the outside world. So that is what is important here. So when that is the case, here you try to understand the true nature and act in accordance with the true nature. Now, when you are angry with somebody, when you fight with somebody, you are disturbed, you are restless for some time. But at the same time, when you have shown your love to somebody and the other person has also shown the love, you are not restless there or uncomfortably restless there. Why? Because the Eastern view is that your true nature is to love, not to hate, not to fight. But what happens? You do things which is not in harmony with your true nature. As a result, there is disturbance, and as a result, many psychological problems occur. And as a result, when you can act in a way in accordance with the true nature, which is the true nature of the universe also, there would be a harmony between the person and the larger universe, and as a result, things can happen in a healthy manner. And the mind needs, for that, the mind needs to be studied through the tools of the mind, not by the tools of the physical sciences or the physical gadgets. As I told you, like the EEG, the scan, etc., can help you in making certain inferences. but they are not accurate to understand your mind. So there is a need to bring in or identify enough tools or appropriate tools to understand the mind, so that the tool could be strengthened, the mind could be strengthened. Only when the mind is strengthened, well, humans can be empowered. Whereas on the other hand, the mind is becoming weaker in the present day life system, and as a result psychological problems are increasing quite often. And we look at more and more problems. Say for example, if you see the COVID lockdown, and everywhere we talked about only the problems or issues of the lockdown, but there have been many benefits also, positive outcomes also, about which most of us have not understood. The mind has to see it in the right direction. That's what I say. So here, what happens is, say for example, if you tell me, I'm a retired person, age of 63, what happens? I'm used to teaching students live in the classroom, and I was not used to teaching online. Whereas now, I am made to learn and acquire a new skill of learning and teaching through a different mode now. So there is a modification, there is an improvement. I can either lecture in a live classroom, or I can lecture in a online mode. Also, I learned the skill right now, which was new for me. And if an option was given earlier to me, I would have said live classes I require. I don't need online classes. But there is a compulsion now to adopt this method, and as a result, COVID lockdown has made online learning, has brought it or implemented it faster. It would have come about 5 or 10 years later, but it has improved the system right now, introduced the system. It has increased the speed of introducing the system right now. The same way, all of us sit together at home with our family members. We can understand, we can interact, we can indulge in many positive qualities, etc. So there are many positive things also. There are many new avenues of employment opportunities, our occupations, etc. So that way it can be used in a positive sense. We need to discuss that. For that we need tools of the mind, not to physical gadgets. That is where the field of psychology and the philosophy, Indian philosophical system, I think we need to work actively to strengthen the field of psychology also. Now, coming to the next aspect, technology. So far, I spoke about the concept of science, philosophy, and the scientific approach in psychology. Now, coming to technology, as a student of psychology, I feel that if human problems are on the increase right now in the present day world, one of the reasons is technological advancement. And I won't blame the technology per se. Again, I would blame only the human mind in that aspect, about which I'll talk later. So, now what is technology? It is a set of knowledge, skills, experience, and techniques through which humans change, transform, and use their environment in order to create tools, machines, products, and services that meet our needs and desires. Important. There are needs, there are desires not only in human beings, in all living organisms, which are to be fulfilled. So, technology should help you fulfill your need, and when your needs are fulfilled, you would become a stronger human being, a more healthy human being. You would function better, and ultimately the whole universe benefit out of that. That is how it should be. And the philosophy of technology. Now, the systematic clarification of the nature of technology as an element and product of human culture. Technology should be seen as a reflection of human culture. So, human culture from a primitive stage has evolved, has brought in improvements, and as a result, it should ultimately result in enhancing the quality of life of life of organisms. And it is the systematic reflection on the consequences of technology for human life. Again, it is the philosophy of technology. That is where I am coming to. It is a systematic reflection on the consequences of technology for human life. When you bring in technology, one is you bring in a new tool, true, but the new tool should help in strengthening the human being. We must, when you bring in a technology, when you make it available to human beings in the society, you must try to see its consequences to the society, to human beings. Like when atom bomb was invented, only the positive outcome was looked at, but the negative thing people never imagined at that time. But what happens now? The same way, technology, let's say for example, computer. When computer came, what happened was this technology will relieve human beings or mechanical activities. They will become more creative. That was the idea. But what happens here? You rely more and more on technology. Then ultimately your efficiency is coming down. You are unable to write, because I have seen many of our students telling us, sir, I had prepared very well for the examination, but I could not writing because I have lost touch with writing. I've been using a computer for quite a long time, so I have lost touch with writing. There's not something to be proud of. So it has created an inefficiency in me. I lost a skill that was there in me. So an internal resource has not been developed and used properly. That's what it implies. The same way, when you see in those days, you used to write a letter to a friend or relation. When you write, you used to think, well, what is it that I want to write? Then how should I communicate? You write it. When the person reads it, he interprets it in a different way, the tone of the letter. There is a misunderstanding. Then he communicates. Then you learn that, well, I should not write it this way, I should write it that way. So accordingly, you relate it with the other side also. You try to do that. When technology has come here, we have not seen the consequences. As a result, we substitute technology for human efforts. That is where the problem is. That is why human beings are actually weakening day by day, psychologically speaking. So you should not substitute technology. On the other hand, use technology to strengthen your internal resources, the mind. Like when I type a word, well, the red line shows that the spelling is wrong. When I know that, well, spelling is wrong in my head, not on the screen. Then what I should do is go to the technology, find out what the right spelling is, correct it in my head, and then correct it on the screen. We don't do that. Just blindly press a button, it is corrected on the screen, but it never is corrected in myself. So I remain with the same mistake, same inadequacy, and as a result I face more and more problems in real life situations. So when that is where again technology is seen only as a convenience to human beings, only as a means of making profit, money, etc. But we have not seen its consequences to human beings. That's why during the early 60s itself, Martin Luther King remarked, our scientific temper has overtaken our spiritual power. We have guided missiles but misguided men. So that is where philosophy has to come in and then guide human beings appropriately in the development of technology also. And the third one is technology, the systematic investigation of the practices of engineering, invention, designing, and making of things. So it is a reflection of our innovativeness. So these are the philosophical aspects of technology. Now, coming to the last aspect of my lecture, we need to evolve a technology which will help us to understand the mind properly, so that human beings can be empowered, the mind can be empowered, and ultimately the person can be happy, satisfied, and productive in life till the end. So the popular concept of mind, as I told you, science is modeled upon physical sciences, and the same type of methodology we try to adapt to human sciences also. And we have become more and more materialistic, and as a result we are unhappy, and disharmony is there in us, because we try to accumulate more and more wealth, material, rather than strengthening our mind. So we have ignored and we have weakened our mind by excessively relying on technology. So philosophy and psychology should work together to understand humans better, empower the mind, so come out with a right technology, a right scientific procedure to understand mind and empower human beings. So, and I hope this conference would help you to look at things from a different way. And I would also suggest, as I suggested earlier, well, philosophy of science and technology, a separate course has to be offered to all the students of especially the physical sciences, so that they can understand the human side of their contribution also, and life could be enriched for everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the patient hearing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. See, any questions from the audience side?